Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at the cyber stuff, right? So as the unit name suggests, we'll be looking at cybersecurity, which has been a development since the information security era. But what we need to understand is that cyber is now capturing a lot more aspects of how digitalized systems work together. Okay, but we're going to look at more specific to security aspect. Okay, so cybersecurity is not only about security mechanisms and methodologies. So hopefully that makes a bit of a distinction from information security. Okay? A broader aspect of cyberspace safety must be considered. So that means there are a lot more activities and interactions in the cyberspace, and as a cybersecurity, it needs to overlook all of those. Okay, and a lot of something nowadays are being proposed. So you probably heard about cyber attacks and cyber security, but there's a lot more cyber stuff. So that's what we're trying to look at here. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of the interest ones here. So in a whole field of cybersecurity, there are a few different activities or events that encapsulated by the cybersecurity space. Okay, so probably best to know about what cybersecurity defines. Okay, so various organizations have tried to define what cybersecurity is, but this one is probably one of the most generic ones that we can find. It's the activity or process, ability or capability, or state whereby information and communication systems and the information contained therein are protected. So you can see that it matched similar to our definition of security in the first video that we saw, right? Kind of resembles it, right? From and or defense against damage, unauthorized use or modification or exploitation. So basically, anything not anticipated should not be happening to our assets in the cyberspace. That's what it's trying to state. Okay? So let's have a look at cyber attacks. So this is the very atomic action that can be done in the cybersecurity space. Okay? Cyber attack is an act of malicious activities in the cyberspace that causes harm to legitimate entities. So this is trying to violate our CIA triad that we covered before. And this will also violate the definition that we just saw. Okay? There are various entities that conduct cyber attacks. So we can categorize who carries out cyber attacks. And that includes script kiddies, black white hat hackers, activists, organized criminals, even nation states. Okay? But as we go down to the very last few categories, it's very difficult to prove that they are actually the entities that are trying to carry out those cyber attacks. So you may have heard in the news some of the attackers from this country or that country are trying to attack us. In Australia, we had a suspicion of, like, sometimes the Chinese hackers, the Russian hackers, the North Korean hackers, or even the other countries, they may have been suspected, but they're all suspected, and it is very difficult to prove that they are actually the ones that are carrying out those attacks unless they admit it, right? Because they are very highly sophisticated, large organizations with highly skilled trainings done. The tracing them is very difficult with current technology. I hope in the coming few years or even a decade, this will be addressed much better. But nevertheless, those are the very high-skilled personnel doing this, but it goes all the way down to who we call script kiddies. Script kiddies are the ones that we refer to as people who just gets the tool, don't really know or understand what are the mechanisms, but just run it. So they just know how to run some tools and it does some amazing stuff. So they just run it. And those guys are much easier to find out and get caught. Yeah. And if we look at how cyber attacks categorizes into this, it's not necessarily intentional, but often than not, it could be arising from mistakes. So somebody forgot to delete a temporary user and password into the system, and some hacker found out those, or some routers sent out to you use the default username and password that were very simple, like admin, and somebody exploit that, and things like that. So those are quite like a mistake, but it can be used as part of the attacks. And then the ones that we defined just before, people with intent, falls into the middle, deliberate class. So people can attack different people with different motives. So depending on what they want to achieve. So script kiddies may just want to see how things work, whereas some more sophisticated hackers, they want to gain some fame or economic value out of it. But maybe some other state actors, like the government oriented ones, may be more politically influenced or socio-culturally influenced, right? So there's many different actions that are caused based on different motives. Right, anyway, let's move on. So the next layer we saw was cybercrime. So now we're moving away from an atomic action now, where we have more sophisticated, organized actions that form cybercrime. So activities in the cyberspace that violates the law and regulations now falls into cybercrime. Obviously, a lot of cyber attacks will fall under cybercrime or will violate, but these cyber criminals are purposely actually violating those regularly. So cyber crimes not only affect financially, but also socially, psychologically, and even physically. So you can think about, for example, people may steal other people's like credit card details or bitcoins. That's financial, but also socially, which means like people may hack into other people's accounts, may find some sensitive information and spread it around or use it as a threat. That would also affect socially and psychologically. So, for example, in politics, when you have an election period coming on, there are often some cyber attacks or even rumors trying to blame, oh, this candidate was doing something illegal or something that the candidate should not be doing. And they can, even if the candidate didn't do it, it could impact them socially as well as psychologically. Okay. And nowadays we use a lot of what we call a cyber-physical system. So you probably heard about IoTs, Internet of Things. Basically what they are is like computers, whether small or large size, that are all around us. Things like sensors, for example, gets used a lot in the agricultural sector. And if the hackers exploit them, for example, and then try to say, oh, this sensor is supposed to be measuring, say, it's 20 degrees, but suddenly made changes to, say, 35 degrees. So as a farmer, misreading the information, trying to turn up the weather control more to be more cold, but it was already cold, so it might kill all the crops, for instance. So this is affecting physically. And this can also apply in critical infrastructures as well, like the sewage systems where you have sensors measuring the water flows and you exploit that. It may burst some sewers, and smart grids, they are sending network packets about electricity measurements. You can exploit that. It can cause like a surge into houses or even a blackout nationally. So those can happen, affecting physical space. Okay? So cyber criminals are starting to get quite dangerous, where it's going to affect us in various ways. Okay? So there are laws and regulations to punish cyber crimes. See the cyber crime details from the Australian Government Attorney General's Department, the link there. But obviously this is still a global issue. So they are happening all around, but we don't necessarily capture all of them. Cyber activism, Okay, so hacktivisms are criminals with motives. So this is a larger subgroup. So they may have specific intentions to do this, not just personal gains, but to demonstrate some intentions or motives. So a good example is the Panama Papers in 2015. So if you're not familiar with it, I suggest you have a look at Google and see what it's about. But basically, it's about roughly 11.5 million leaked documents that are sensitive to people's finance. So it's about like a secret financial documents for individuals relating to like offshore entities. So people trying to have their wealth stored in somewhere else, and all of those papers were included. Right? The documents contained personal financial information about wealthy individuals and public officials that had previously been kept private. This is actually breaching people's privacy, whether it's right or wrong. However, people are still doing these kind of activities that violates laws and regulations, but because they have an intention and motives, they carry these out. Okay, so the purpose of these attacks can include things like political issues, free speech, and trying to prove a point. Okay, so those people are getting more organized in their actions in order to achieve their purposes. Okay, why did I go backwards? And then the last layer that we saw was the cyber warfare. So basically, this involves entities trying to attack each other, and this can be from an individuals to a large organizations and groups of people who are carrying these activities out. Okay, this involves orchestrated cyber attacks, hacktivism, as well as spies, espionage, sabotage, propaganda, and deterrence. So there's a lot more activities and actions gets involved as part of the cyber warfare. There are no widely accepted rules on what defines a cyber warfare, hence the arguments. But I guess this also applies same in the physical domain, right? So if you were practice shooting missiles, like sometimes the North Koreans do you think that's an act of war, or they're just practicing their security defense, right? There's a split opinions based on who the allies or who they are close with, right? As a result, there may be a lot more damaging consequences as out of the cyber warfare compared to some of the other stages that we have seen previously. Okay, so let's have a look at the importance of cyber. What cyber does is it's quite separated from our physical space. So like our buildings, our cars, what we see is quite different to what we see in the cyberspace. However, the gap between is getting a bit much smaller and smaller as more technologies are being developed. So our first layer between the two was cyber-physical systems, where physical domain functions were controlled by the cyber functions. Okay, and then more and more items were introduced, which close the gap further down. For example, you can control your cars using your mobile phones in your new smart cars. You can control and dictate what your TV displays. And this is getting more and more in that area. So the SCADA system is part of the cyber-physical systems, but it's getting more comprehensive in what it's able to control. There are a lot of sensor networks nowadays, not just for agriculture, but for smart cities or whatnot. And smart grid is another good example where a cyber attack can physically impact the physical space and influence a lot of people's lives. Okay. So here's a question. I hope that everyone's aware of their privacy data when you're using your social media, and I think Facebook is one of the most widely used social media, so you may have one, or maybe I'm the old guy who's still using one. Nevertheless, whichever platform you're using, often the platform will try to collect some data, and if you read the terms and conditions, of course those are done for the good purposes, but can you trust them, right? So for instance, Facebook collected your private data. What type of cyber attack is this? How would you label it? Is this a cyber crime? If yes, what type? Could it be an unintentional activism? Any other thoughts on this, right? So there's a lot of questions that can be asked, even with just somebody collecting your data. As you probably seen 2-3 years ago on the trial, that this was exactly the issue that Mark Zuckerberg had to explain at the high courts. Okay? So if you're not familiar with how to go about answering these, you may refer to have a look at and dig up what was the outcomes of the trials and what happened. Otherwise, we'll stop here and then we'll move on to looking at cryptos from the next videos. Okay, bye-bye.